All right, welcome back to part 2 of the One Piece 3D logo animation series. If you haven't seen part 1, it is linked down below. Today, I'm going to tackle the lighting and materials, and I try to talk through what I'm doing, what I'm trying to achieve, why I think they did things the way they did. And when I do have to take shortcuts, I kind of explain why or what I might do differently to try and get closer to the result from the actual animation. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's talk about the lighting and get started with it. Taking a look at the reference image, I did duplicate it and just move one up here. It looks like we have a light kind of coming from the top. Perhaps it's this warm light. We also have a warm light kind of illuminating the right side of the skull, and then a cool light, almost like a rim light here for the hat, illuminating the left side of the skull. Everything else seems lit pretty evenly, so we might be able to use an HDRI for that, but let's go ahead and get started. Actually, before I start the IPR there, I'm going to create an area light, make sure I turn it into a target light by clicking on this little arrow and choosing Add Target Tag and Null. I'm going to place the target on the skull since that's what I'm primarily focused about with this lighting here. So I know it's going to go off to the side. Now we can start our IPR. And I'm going to want this light to only affect the skull. I don't want it to affect the text. So I'll go in the project tab here where we can exclude or include. And I'm going to exclude our letters. And so now we can see that. And this light, I think maybe can be a little bit taller. Should be warm. So let's try and make it a little warm. Something like that. And then perhaps try and match kind of the angle here. So I think we're going to need to pull the light back a little bit. And you can see how it's kind of moving to the side there. Something like that looks pretty good. You know, I think their hat is a little bit flatter in the front. And obviously the skull might have a little bit different proportions, but that looks pretty good to me. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this light after I name it warm by holding Control, just clicking and dragging on my move tool there. This will be our cool light. Okay, so let's change the color to that. And we can start there. And hopefully that looks pretty good. So once again, I think with the difference of hat shape that, we're going to need to pull it very, very far behind. It's almost like a rim light here. I'm going to switch to my 4 views here because then I can see my lights and work with them in, say, like a top view, which can make this process a little bit easier and more convenient. And so that's looking almost about as good as I think I'm going to be able to get it, in terms of that rim light. I mean, even if I go a little bit further behind, we almost lose it completely. So I think something like that is about as good as we can do. And I can also look at my reference down here and see, yeah, that seems to be looking okay. I wish there was maybe just a little bit more light on the skull. So perhaps I'll move it just a bit more like that. Now for this top section here, the light up above, I suppose it could be this warm light, but I'm not really seeing kind of the cool light down here. So what I'm going to do is turn off these lights and just create a spotlight. All right. And I'm going to create a spotlight. The one thing I don't like about a spotlight is that it's not an area light. So we'll have to be a bit careful with that. I'm going to do the same thing as well, turning it into a target light. Even though with this, I'm going to want the target to be kind of the middle top part of the text. So I've moved that there. I can now come here to my light, move it up above. And one thing I'm going to want to do with this light, at least for right now, is exclude it from my reference plane here because I don't want that blocking any light. So we can do that. And then I think we're going to have to crank up our illumination here in order to see this. So we can see something like that. And that's looking okay. I do think we're going to want it to be kind of more from behind. So we can light it kind of like that, I think is about as good as we're going to get this. If I move it a little bit in front or more to the front, we start to get potentially some harsh shadows on the insides here, which I don't necessarily want, although I don't mind that as much as I thought I would. You can see if I move it forward, those are those harsh shadows I want to avoid. I could also increase that angle a bit just to make sure I get all of the text and not, forget about the letter on the end there. So we can move this back a little, maybe something like that. And I do think this light was a little bit warm, so we can do that here. And I do think using color temperature is a little bit better way sometimes of working with color, only because you can get a little bit more accurate, more realistic with values and colors you're using in your light. So we can turn back our other lights on and see this is what we have, and see that for the most part, our scene is still pretty dark. So what I'm gonna do is start with a dome light. Actually, it's not there, it is here. And I ended up using just good old Studio 21 from the asset browser, even though it says it can't find it, which means I must have misspelled it, but I know it's there. And we'll have to scroll down a little bit to find it. There it is, because I have the grayscale ones. We can turn off the background just to get a sense of what this looks like. And honestly, this doesn't look too bad. I like how the front of the skull is still a little bit dark. Okay, that's kind of matching what we have there. Their skull, the eyes and the nose is quite a bit darker. I don't know if that's actually like painted in there or if it's shadows. I think, for the most part though, we're pretty good. Maybe I'll turn this intensity down to say 0.5. And I wonder if we shouldn't only have this affect the text, right? So include, just do the letters. All right, I like that. And then maybe what we do to just brighten up the front of the skull a little bit is create another dome light. And we are going to keep it with just the white color here, uncheck background. But we're going to use this at a very low intensity, and this would be excluded from the text. So it's working on everything but. So this dome light here is only working on the text. This one above it is working on everything but. So call this dome light text, and just call that skull. So that way we're staying organized here. And I can take this value down because I want it to be just maybe a little bit brighter. So super subtle, but just, I don't know, it's 0.1. Yeah, maybe just something like that. So that looks pretty good to me for the lighting. All right, maybe could go just a touch higher. But yeah, that's pretty much all I did for lighting. The only thing I'm not a fan of is how bright the spotlight is there. And so I thought we excluded this. So we could switch this to include now and have it only work on the letters. There we go. So that's looking quite a bit better. And with that, we'll move on to the materials. We'll start with the gold here. I like to point out that there are quite a few places where there's definitely some geometry detail in here where there's kind of nicks, cuts, divots taken out of it, right? So you can see that there. And then also, when we see this from an angle, we can see there are quite a few scratches, but then there's also parts that are still pretty reflective. So that's kind of what we're going to be aiming for with our gold material. And we'll get started by just creating material, naming it gold, applying it to our text. And to make gold is pretty easy. You can just set metalness to 1 and then use your base color to tint the metal whatever color you want. I should probably start my renderer to make sure that we're kind of on track with the color. And that looks pretty good. Maybe it should be just a touch closer to yellow. I can use that for the time being. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I'm going to open up my node editor. And once I do that, I can search for imperfections, but not in materials, but in all. So I'm going to use one of these scratches. Why don't we try this one? So I guess it's technically the 4th scratches. We can connect this to our roughness. And let's see what we get. And, I feel like some of these imperfections are almost inverted. Though if I'm being honest, this almost looks a bit too not imperfect enough, but we'll see. Let's create a ramp node, connect that in here, because we're going to invert this. And while I could use the color invert node, I'm probably also going to do some work with the black and white values. And so I can do it all in here. Though I am going to get rid of the attribute manager there and just use the one a little bit to the right here. So we can invert the gradient by just right clicking on it and choosing invert. You can also do that up here. So yeah, I think this one may be just a little bit too perfect for an imperfect. So we'll use a different scratches, just connect that up. There we go. Much better. And so we've inverted this, but I still think the gold is, too shiny in the parts where there's not a scratch. So what we're going to do is take this black color here and we're going to just make it a little bit brighter. So maybe something like 7 or 8% is going to blur that just enough, right? So it doesn't look so clean. And honestly, I think that looks, pretty good. All right. I experimented with displacement for those kind of nicks and cuts in the geometry here. I just wasn't getting a good result. So unless I was going to make the texture from scratch, I don't know if using one of these imperfection textures is going to give me the result I want. The good news is we can do this very easy with geometry. So what I can do is create a plane and rotate this plane. And I want to place it so it's just kind of in front of the bevels there. Make it the size of the text. Not too much bigger than it. That looks good. We'll create a cloner with a cube. And this cube is going to be much smaller, although probably should have just made the cube size I want to start. So we'll do that. So something like that. Looks pretty good. Be just a little bit taller. Perfect. Great. We're not going to clone in a grid mode. We want to use object mode and clone them onto our plane we created. We're then going to apply a random effector, but we're not going to, and I keep having this happen where when I have my node editor open, I can't switch to another object. In my attribute manager, it's stuck on whatever material I am on. So I found if you just reset your user interface and get rid of the node editor, that works. So I don't want to randomize position. I want to randomize rotation, and it is on the bank axis here. And I can decide how many I want, if I want more or less of these. I may just want a few more, something like that. Good, looks good. We're going to hide the plane and want to make sure these aren't going too far back into the letter. I think they may be going just a touch too far back. So I'll move up the plane even though it's hidden. So I just want these, to do something like that. So just kind of take a little bit of a notch, a cut, a slice out, of those bevels. And I'm going to do that with a bool. I could probably also do it with a volume object, but the bool works plenty good for this. So I'm going to find the bool. There we go. Put that in here along with our extrude and our cloner. And I'll probably get the order wrong, and I did. So the extrude goes on top. And I found that, if you think you're doing everything right in the bool and it's not working, unchecking high quality can help. And in a perfect world, I'd be able to keep that high quality. You can see, in this case, turning it off helped. And so we can see those notches in parts that have been cut out. And now if we render this, okay, we can't see them. Okay, so that's a bit unfortunate. The good news is there's a few different ways we could fix this. The first thing I could do would be to go back into my gold material here and use a round corners, right? In general, that would help give us a little bit more reflectivity on those beveled edges that we're creating with this. And that seems to be doing a pretty good job of kind of faking some rounded edges, a bevel, if you will, on those places that are cut out. You can see it maybe just a little bit. Could I maybe increase that a little bit more? I absolutely could. The other thing we could do to cheat this is apply a slightly different material to the end result of the bool. Because for instance, if you take this and only put this material on the extrude, notice how now those pieces that are being cut with the boule have nothing on them, right? They don't have a material because the cloner doesn't have anything on them. So what we could do to cheat this would be to duplicate this gold material, call it gold light, and just make this color a little bit brighter. And just so we can see it, I'll do something a little bit more dramatic there. Put that on the cloner. And that's perhaps not as dramatic as I was hoping for. Good news is we can kind of do that. See if we can get it to look a little bit better. And maybe that's helping a little. All right. Another thing I noticed though is, and this happens a lot when you use an extrude or even the text object here, is that our texture doesn't look very good on the sides. It looks squished, and that's because it's using the UVW mapping. So we can switch it to cubic, and we should see that it now looks a lot better on the sides, no longer being squished. We could also do that on our gold material. And I think some of this too just might be a little bit of a lighting issue. You know, the text still looks perhaps a little bit dark compared to what I'm seeing from theirs. And, you know, we could easily fix that by just coming here to our dome light and brightening this up just a touch. Maybe something like that. So I think that looks pretty good now for the gold, right? I'm seeing some of these cuts kind of get a little bit more visible. You know, we could maybe try one other thing, and that would be these cubes. We could try filleting the edges, and that's going to round out the inside just a little bit. So maybe that will help catch the reflections a little bit more, and it seems to be doing that. So maybe take this gold color a little bit back closer to our other gold, which, see, now even this is kind of screwing up. So yeah, I mean, I'll leave it as is for right now, just so we can see this. But I think the gold material is just about done. All right, so now we're going to move on to the materials for the skull and bones. I want to point out that, you know, this is probably where we're taking the most amount of shortcuts, because I don't have any of the, you know, cracks in there, little imperfections in the teeth, any of that stuff, but we're still going to try and get something that has a similar kind of roughness to it. You know, the surface is very imperfect here, quite porous almost. I probably would try and do something like this with a volume builder, but we're going to try and do it all in the material. See what we can end up with. So we'll start with a new material. Let's call this bone. And we're going to use a noise, specifically a Maxon noise. Connect this to our color. And the color we're going to start with here will, you know, just be a color from our image, our reference. You know, now I know you don't always have an image like this to kind of grab colors from, but hopefully when you're doing something, you are doing research, finding some reference to get started on. Honestly, I hate all of these colors that I've been picking, which is why I keep picking them over and over again. Even this one I don't like, so I am just going to, yeah, we'll start with that. Make sure we apply this bone material to the crossbones and the skull for now, even Luffy. All right. Okay. Thought for a second that's the way mine looked. Not the case. All right. So a bit dark, a bit too shiny. So what we'll do is take this, brighten this up, maybe make our darkest color our lightest, because there really isn't that much variation in the color. You know, a few things here or there, but, you know, for the most part, I think that'll work. Want to solo this because you can see the noise is not where we're going to want this. I'm going to start by changing the noise to gaseous, which is the second from the bottom. I know you can't see that. And it's still way too small. You know, what I could do is select the texture tag here on the material tag, I should say, on those three things I applied it to, and switch the UVW mapping to cubic before maybe coming back and making this larger, something like maybe even a little bit larger like that. Right, so that looks pretty good from a color point of view. You know, maybe a bit too much contrast. So lighten that up just a touch. Reflectivity wise, going to increase the roughness lower the reflectivity just to maybe make this a little bit soft, right? But not too shiny. And we can start with this for our bump map, which of course we're going to need a bump map node, as well as a color mix. So let's get all of these things created and connected. And I forgot that one. We're going to increase the bump map amount to like 7. And duplicate that noise. Get rid of that extra bump map. All right, so with this second noise, I'm going to make this much smaller. But before I do that, I want to make sure I set the values on our first noise to white and black to get as much contrast in there as possible. From those colors, do the same thing here. Right, and now I'm going to make this much smaller because there were some really small kind of areas on there. In fact, I may use a different one. Why don't we try displace turbulence? And why don't we, let's see, do a low clip and high clip kind of thing to help with this. Yeah, maybe something like that. Oops. Still maybe want this, smaller. Yeah, something like that. Okay, been making a lot of changes, not really seeing what they do. So honestly, that's looking pretty good, but I think we're only seeing our larger noise here. So we can start bringing up the strength on our smaller one. And we can see what that would look like kind of on its own. So I do think just kind of a mix looks pretty good of about 50-50. We could always try and use another noise to determine where we're going to see one. So that's going to be our mix amount here. Probably would use a different noise pattern. Why don't we try this blistered turbulence even? Maybe make it a little bit larger. Add some more contrast. So maybe work with the low clip and high clip a little bit here. Yeah, something like that. Maybe that will give us some areas where we see one more than the other. So that seems to be working pretty good. And I think that's going to be kind of our base material we work with here. So what I can do is create another material, or duplicate, I should say, our first material for the teeth. And we might as well start it from scratch with this, because I'm going to disconnect the bump. Okay, I'm going to lower the weight, raise the reflectivity. Let's add this to the teeth so we can kind of see what we're working with here. We want this to be a little bit smoother, a little bit shinier. So weight, right? We don't want, super shiny teeth, but maybe something like that looks pretty good. Just gives a little bit of contrast. And I'll duplicate my bone material one more time for the skull, because if I refer back to what we're seeing here, notice how far back the eye sockets and nose go. I don't know if that's just kind of the proportions of the characters or whatever, but I don't have that in mind. And while I could probably sculpt and push those areas back, another way of doing that would be to just kind of fake it with a vertex map. So what I'm going to do is select the skull, right click on it, go to other tags and choose vertex map. I'm going to paint where I want those darker areas. I need to make sure I switch the mode to add here. And since I can't really see anything without it, I'm going to turn on the lines. Now, I'm not trying to be perfect with this, so I can go, quickly as possible. Something like that. Looks like it'll be pretty good. Something like this. Maybe forgot that area. And I'm going to smooth this out here shortly so I don't have to be perfect. So maybe something like that for the noise, or the nose. Once again, I can hold down Control to kind of remove parts I don't like. Make sure I get those different angles. And I'm going to leave the scar here for just a second because I'm going to smooth everything, and I don't want to smooth that part. So smooth, about 5 iterations. Click that a couple times and you can see how that softened everything up. Now what I would do, back to add, it's really tricky to see the scar here, but I'm just kind of eyeballing it, something like that. I think is what we have. And I want to smooth that just a touch. So why don't we switch this to smooth again, lower the iterations or whatever that is to say 2. And yeah, there we go. Looks pretty good. So now what we can do in our skull material is 1, make sure it's applied to our object. And we're going to load that vertex map we just created into the vertex attribute. And in the vertex attribute node is where we drag in our vertex map. And just for fun, I'm going to connect that to our base color here. And you can see that the eyes are now kind of bright. All those areas we just painted are white, and the other areas are dark. So what we're going to do is use a color mix here to help us with this. Okay, so we'll use our max on noise is input 1. The vertex attribute is the mix amount. And let's just connect this and kind of see what we have. All right, so we have this where, you know, the majority of the skull looks good. It's just those areas we painted that are too bright. The good news is it's being controlled by input 2. And so we can make this as dark as we need. We don't necessarily have to go to pure black, just kind of wherever we want, whatever looks good. Because if I go too far, what we may see is that it becomes very obvious that this is kind of faked. So if I just need to soften it up a little bit, use a gray value, I think that, you know, can look pretty good. We still have maybe a little bit of kind of like a part here where you can see it's almost faked. I may have wanted to extend that just a bit outward, but I think that has more to do with the lighting than anything else. And as we get further away, since, you know, our end, you know, something like this, I think that's going to work just fine. So I think that looks pretty good with the bone material. And with that, we'll move on. Moving on to the hat material here. Since this is a model I got off of TurboSquid, it actually came with a few textures. And so while you can load textures directly from the texture node, right, and browse and find the image, you can also just drag them in from Windows Explorer or Finder on a Mac. So I know my Windows Explorer is out of frame, but I can just drag in, say, the bump map I need, where that came with this, along with the straw for the base color. And I like this because they come in named. And so if these are named appropriately, straw base color, straw bump, straw roughness, it makes putting this together much easier. So we also need a bump map node here. Let's connect that. Right. And I'm going to take the hat material and, you guessed it, apply it to the hat. So that looks pretty good. Maybe still a bit too shiny. Before I actually turn that down, maybe increasing the bump will help, since maybe we can get a little bit more detail out of there. I could also try connecting the bump to reflection roughness. And that helps a little bit as well to get rid of some of those shinier parts. I feel like the pattern here is a bit too large. So I'm going to select the material tag and just have it repeat, you know, 2 times. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm looking for any seams. Since this object should be UVW mapped, I don't think it'll be a huge deal, but I don't know if this texture is tileable. So just want to make sure I don't see anything too crazy. And that looks pretty good. I actually think it's quite a bit smaller than what we were seeing in this. And this is kind of weird texture. It doesn't really look like straw from this close. So, you know, and theirs kind of goes around in a circle. I don't know. Yeah, no, this one does. So why don't we back this down to 1.5 and we'll call that good. All right, now we just have the red ribbon, and there's only one texture for this, and it's just called ribbon. So, you know, we can see there's some detail here that is in this image, so we can use it in a couple of other properties perhaps. Bump. Connect this. Obviously, applying this would help. So let's apply it to the hat and red cloth. Looks pretty good. Still maybe a bit large, so we'll tile this maybe 3 times. Get that pattern smaller. Looks good. I may want, it almost looks like leather now with how shiny it is, so we can maybe increase the roughness a bit. Also, maybe use sheen. And instead of making it white here, why don't we eyedrop the red and just make it brighter. I don't think we're seeing a lot of that just with how dramatic the lighting is here, but it certainly can't hurt to add it. The bump may be a little bit too much, so I'll back that down to 0.4 perhaps. All right, and so I'm pretty happy with how things are coming together. Let's talk about the blue material. So first, there are these characters that I actually made in Illustrator and then brought over into Photoshop. So, I'm going to have to do that anyway or something for this texture. Now, the rest of it, once again, gets a bit tricky. The blue, it almost looks like there could be a gradient here, but it also could just be, from the lighting where maybe we're getting a little bit of extra blue from, one of these lights. These shadows look like they could be coming from the light up above, but it almost looks like there's a little bit of ambient occlusion here. And so that could have been done, in the material using the ambient occlusion node, or perhaps making an ambient occlusion AOV. I'm going to show you a really neat technique for being able to paint exactly what you want on text like this without having to UV unwrap your geometry. So I'm going to go into a front view here. I'm going to solo my text. And I already have geometry only turned on, but that's important to make sure. So that way we get as clean of an area as possible. I'm then going to screen grab that area. So however you take a screenshot of your monitor or your workspace or whatever, different for Windows 10, 11, Mac, all that good stuff. So here I am in Photoshop now, and I already have my characters. Now, I did make these in Illustrator. I brought them over, collapsed it to help speed things up, and then obviously my reference image. So I'll start a new document and paste what was on my clipboard, which was just essentially my perspective view. Now, what I'm going to do is start by creating a mask from this gray area here. So I have just my text to work with. So I can just go to select and choose select color range, click on the gray. You can see it's already kind of done that for me. When I hit OK, it will make that selection. And so when I create a mask, it's actually masking out the gold and keeping the gray. So that's the opposite of what we want. So I will invert this mask. I can hit Control or Command I. And so then we have our gold, which could be a nice place to start, maybe add a hue and saturation to turn that blue, but instead I'll just do that with a gradient. Now, it seems like in the gradient tool, they made it more like Illustrator's gradient, which I'm still getting used to, so I apologize. But what I'm gonna do is, and I can't even see my cursor because of the transparency there, so why don't I just paint bucket, essentially that gray color there before coming back to this. There's my gradient, and I'm going to start here and just kind of drag down, right? So something like that. And it's kind of hard to judge how this looks until I take my mask and I'm holding Alt to drag up and apply it to my gradient and kind of just see how things look. So that looks okay to me. I wish it was perhaps a bit lower. You can kind of come back into your gradient and make adjustments to it. So, reverse it, change colors and whatnot. So maybe even have it go a little bit lower, perhaps, right? So why don't we work with that? So what I'm going to do now is I can turn off kind of all this stuff. I am going to want a duplicate of that layer here without the mask. So I can do that. And I also need to crop this down so it's just the size of the text. So I'm going to use some guides to help do that for me, because this is going to be important when we save this image out in order to make sure it fits the text from the front projection. And I may need to zoom in here since it seems to be automatically snapping to the edge of my document and not, there we go, the edge of those pixels. So yeah, we'll be using kind of the front or frontal projection to get this to fit. And so making sure this matches kind of the dimensions of our geometry is what allows us to do this without actually having to UVW map this ourselves. And so if you don't understand that, it'll all make sense very, very soon. So something like that looks good. There's my full blue, which will be important. But now what I can do is with our text, I'm going to have to get a little bit destructive for this. So I'm going to come over here to layer, oops, and then rasterize. So I can rasterize that gradient and then apply this mask to it. And then what I'm going to do is apply a layer style here, starting with the stroke. And I know that's cut off there. I do apologize. And we can see the stroke. Great. That looks pretty good. I'm also going to do a color overlay, and I want that to be white. And you'll see why here very soon. So what I'm going to do now is convert this to a smart object so I can work with my blending modes. Turn on my other layer underneath this, because now I can switch this to multiply, and I'm just bringing out our stroke. And then what I'm going to do is blur this. Right now, I want to double check something here. So it's just, yeah, it's not having any effect on our gradient. So I'm going to blur this, and I can make this as soft or as, dark as I need to. So maybe we'll just use something like 16. Okay, I could always use different amounts of blur on different layers. So I could duplicate this, which would just darken it, but then I could also double click on my Gaussian blur because it's a smart filter here and come in and make one layer less blurred. Okay, so something like that could work. I don't think we'll need that, so we'll just stick with this. And so the last thing is going to be the characters, which should already be pretty much positioned as I need them. So I will select all this, copy it, and then make sure I paste it in place by doing Command or Control Shift V. All right, so that looks good, but I do want that above the shadow there, and I can save this out. So I'm going to save this as text new. Okay, we can now come back into Cinema 4D and make the actual material. So I'll just hit the plus sign, name this blue text, open up our node editor here, dock it again. Typically I would have kind of a pre-saved layout, but I haven't gotten that far yet. Going to turn this off again and drag in my texture, right? Notice the name, great. Connect that to our base color. And it is nice that Redshift can work with PSDs, not only as a flattened image, but also individual layers. So that's really cool. I think that's relatively new, though I'll be honest, I don't use PSDs as textures too often. We can now apply this to our extrude, and we're going to make sure it's only on the front cap by using the selection C1. And now we need to fit it. So I'm going to switch to my perspective view just so we can kind of get an idea of what's happening. Because right now the projection is set to UVW mapping. So whatever the default is for text is what it's using. But I want to use flat or frontal, really. Same difference. So I'll use flat. And I'm going to go into texture mode so you can see this is the size of the texture projection, essentially our image. We need it to be the same size as our geometry. So what I'm going to do is right click and do fit to object. And that will fit it, once I hit yes to include sub-objects, to our text. And that's why it was important to kind of crop that image to be the exact size. So now what we can do is take a look at this rendered, because I'm not seeing a lot of that, kind of shading that we added. So we may want to go back and add a bit more, although honestly, it doesn't look too bad. It is relatively subtle, which I like. What I would be curious about, though, is if we were to just come back and just double up what we had. So I think that's what I did there, but just to confirm, let's just reduplicate out that layer. And all I need to do is save this, overwrite the existing one, back in Cinema, right? Select my texture, and then reload it. See what happens. I may need to force Redshift to refresh. Yeah, so that looks a little bit better to me. And like I said, we're kind of faking that ambient occlusion where, it's quite possible it's from shadows or lights. The gradient, and it does match the image, and I had previously worked with different color spaces, but the gradient looks like it's getting kind of crushed down a bit as well. So that might be something I would want to perhaps spend a little bit more time working with, but honestly, I think this is pretty good. The rope material, actually looks better on the individual kind of coiled rope here than it does compared to the one we twisted and split the ends on ourself. So if I was actually doing this, I mentioned how I probably would have stuck with that rope type for everything, and then I might have gone a little bit different direction with the rope. But this looks really good on kind of the coiled parts, which is why I'm sticking with it. So new material here. I'm going to drag in some textures I found online for rope. If you just search rope material, they're pretty easy to find. We can connect the base color up and our roughness and get out our other nodes for our bump map and displacement. Still kind of boggles my mind. We have to create a bump map node and a displacement node. It can't just be baked into the material like pretty much every other renderer I've used. But bump map here, we'll connect up. Oops, I missed it. To the bump map, connect up our displacement to the texture input or text map, which is of course not the same as the texture input because that would make sense. And let's apply this rope material to the rope and then to rope 1 and rope 2. And honestly, the first time I did this, I kind of freaked out because it looks really bad. And at first I was like, is it the, texture coordinates? Because I should have applied this first. This one is still kind of, parametric in that it's all being done with deformers. So this one should work. But the big thing we have to think about is this texture, right? This is a very kind of small piece of rope we're seeing. So we need to tell it that the geometry is much taller. So what we're going to do is tell it to repeat in the Y 60 times. And you can see how that has pretty much kind of fixed the problem. You can see, some of that extra detail there. And so I just need to do that for all the textures. Now, could I use a node to do all that for me and then connect it? Probably like a float or something, or an integer node. Yes. Could I probably also do that in the material tag like I've done a few times before? Absolutely. But why not just do it there? So you can kind of see what we get right now. And if we turn this on, you can maybe start to see what I'm talking about. There's that kind of unstretched out texture. You can kind of see what I'm talking about here. It looks okay, but I do feel like it looks a lot better there. Now, even though we've kind of connected everything, we still have some work to do. So let's start with our normal map here. We want to make sure this is a tangent space normal. And we need to switch the color space to raw, which I know is off screen, but that's what you want to look for. So that changes the shading, and the normal now looks a lot better. We could maybe increase this, especially if we weren't going to be using any displacement, but I think we're going to be fine with displacement. So I'm not going to worry too much about that. Even though this is connected up just like we've done before, we're now going to use a Redshift object tag. So I'm going to select all these pieces of rope. So the individual cylinders, the ropes, so I could probably just do it right there and add the Redshift object tag. And then go into geometry, check override, turn on displacement. And once again, as I'm kind of setting this up, I like to uncheck enable auto bump mapping and also disconnect my normal map. So that way I know exactly what I'm looking at. Shoot, we might even want to disconnect the other properties so we're not, being confused. At the very least, I think that will help. So you can almost see a little bit of perhaps a displacement starting to happen, but I'm going to select these tags again and turn on tessellation. Now, I don't necessarily mind if this does the smooth subdivision like we had previously. I definitely want to check the ends to make sure they're not doing anything I don't want. But without too much extra work, you can see that we are getting, you know, that shape of the rope. If I wanted to push it a bit further, once again, maybe turn up the maximum displacement to like 5. And that doesn't do anything because we also need to increase the displacement scale. So we can do like 3. That's way too much. Why don't we just cut it in half? Okay, so 0 is not cutting that in half. 1.5 is. So that's looking, you know, pretty good. About as much as I can probably expect to get out of this displacement map. Once again, I'm thinking about how close we really get to it. And the answer is not all that close. You know, we start, if you recall the animation, zoomed in to Luffy here before kind of zooming out. So I don't think we have to worry too much about this. So I think we're in a good spot. I will select our tags one more time to enable auto bump mapping, connect back our color and our normal into the bump. And, you know, looking at it, I may want to try and darken things up a bit. Also, I think it actually looks pretty good. You know, just the rope itself. We may just be displacing it a little bit too much and causing some intersecting geometry here. So may want to turn that down just a bit, but I think we can keep it for now. But yeah, I may want to kind of darken this up. It seems a little bit light. I'm just going to adjust the gamma here. So we can not lower it, but raise it just a bit to perhaps darken it a little. So maybe something like 1.5 looks pretty good. You know, I could use a color correct, and oftentimes I do, to make those types of changes because I found as you work with gamma, it tends to either desaturate or saturate the color too much. And so, you know, I'm hesitant to just do it in gamma, but I think it worked out well for this. And I do try and be consistent with where I make these types of changes. So rather than, you know, do this in gamma, I might do it in color correct because I use the color correct node more often. Same type of thing with changing the scale here. You know, if I'm going to do it there, then, you know, the other times we've made things repeat, and I can't think of a material off the top of my head, the hat ribbon, you know, maybe I should have done it in the textures as well. So doing those types of changes the exact same way over and over is going to make things more consistent. It's going to be easier to find and make those changes should you want to do something about it. But I think with that, we have wrapped up the materials part of this project. So that will do it for part 2. In part 3, I will finish up this series going through the animation, background, and compositing. If you could do me a favor and like and subscribe to my channel, I'd appreciate it. And if there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. Until next time, take care.